At Texas A&M, experimenters cruelly breed dogs to get canine muscular dystrophy, even though after 30 years, experiments there have failed to find any connection to the human version of the disease. It's a sick practice, but PETA's close to ending it with your help. It's next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, the latest on the cruel Texas A&amp dog labs, the new documents PETA has obtained that show how dogs are treated there.
What was really horrifying to us is to read how many times they would artificially inseminate a female dog. And, this is basically rape. They're injecting basically a plunger into the dog's vagina to inject the semen from a male dog. Some of these female dogs had artificial insemination done as many as 7 times through a limited period. And this is incredibly invasive, incredibly painful, and really traumatizing to the dogs.
Dr. Alka Chandna, PETA Vice President, on what new documents obtained reveal about the cruel experiments at the Texas A&M Dog Lab. After a 2-year campaign, PETA has filed a new lawsuit involving Facebook's algorithm and censorship, as well as another suit over yet more documents. Plus, there's protests as the school year ends to bring awareness to hideous experiments on dogs that have yet to produce a cure for human muscular dystrophy after 30 years of failed science. How can you help stop Texas A&M? That's next on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. This is episode 68 in our second season of shows. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you just found us, welcome. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. For more on the Texas A&M Dog Labs, check out episode 32 and the muscular dystrophy patient who spoke out against Texas A&M's cruelty. And for more on the bad science, check out episode 9. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. There's also a link to a survey in our show notes if you're so inclined. We'd love to get your feedback. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Echo, just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Dr. Alka Chandna, PETA VP, talks about how a 2-year campaign against the dog labs at Texas A&M may be close to success if the public understands what's at stake. The update on the new legal pressure on the university and the on-campus protests on the PETA Podcast.
Well, it was back in December of 2016 that PETA launched its campaign to end the use of dogs in cruel muscular dystrophy experiments at Texas A&M University. We obtained video footage of these dogs. They are purposely bred to have canine muscular dystrophy. This is a painful and debilitating disease, and the dogs consequently have difficulty walking. Running is out of the question. They don't play, and they even have difficulty breathing, swallowing, eating. So the dogs are in a horrible state. So that was back in 2016, December of 2016, that we launched our campaign. And since then, we've had a very vigorous campaign to let the Texas A&M community and others know about what's going on.
All right, so we have the canine muscular dystrophy, and we've got what they're doing to the dogs. And the purpose of why they're doing this to the dogs is because they see a connection between canine muscular dystrophy and human muscular dystrophy. But Is there?
The point that you make is exactly correct. Ostensibly, the idea is that they're trying to find cures to human muscular dystrophy, but the diseases are different, and diseases manifest, as I'm sure most of your listeners would know, diseases manifest at the cellular level, and they're impacted by things like genetics and metabolism, all of these other issues. We know, for example, that we can ourselves eat chocolate, and we might eat so much of it that we feel sick, and we know that even a relatively small amount of chocolate will kill a dog. So just from that simple example, we realize that we cannot apply results from dogs to human beings and vice versa. And disease manifests at these levels where we are different. And consequently, we've seen that there have been findings in dogs, for example, understanding how canine muscular dystrophy manifests, the manner in which the disease comes into being, how it moves through the body, how it impacts the different organ systems. And what we have found is that we simply cannot apply that information to human beings. And so treatments that seem to show promise in dogs never materialized for human beings. So this has been a real problem. And in fact, as some of your listeners will from previous interviews that you've done on this subject, the lead experimenter at Texas A&am, a guy named Joe Cornegay, has been breeding dogs to have muscular dystrophy since 1981. And we all know there's no cure to muscular dystrophy. And in fact, there's not even a treatment that reverses the debilitating symptoms of human muscular dystrophy. So these decades of experiments, the decades of imposing debilitation and pain on hundreds of dogs has resulted in nothing for human beings. In contrast, what we've seen is that millions of dollars have gone into this experimentation, and we've also funneled limited resources, brain power, laboratory space. Young graduate students who are coming up could have been working on something that might have actually materialized into something useful for human beings, but instead all of that has been wasted in this fruitless effort.
Basically, though, as far as this goes, these useless tests, these wasteful tests, you've been trying to stop it, but they continue to go on. What does Texas A&am say? They say, well, we've been doing this all along. We're going to get to an answer soon.
Well, yes. I mean, this is sort of what we see pretty consistently with animal experimenters. They're always saying that a cure is right around the corner. And it seems that we live in a world with many corners because, it's like the check is always in the mail. We don't really get there. And so that's one of the things that Texas A&am has been saying. They've been trying to justify the immense cruelty and pain, suffered by these dogs in its laboratory by saying that we want to help human patients. And meanwhile, nothing has materialized. And they've been saying for years and issuing news releases for years saying that something is going to happen. They're always trumpeting when some treatment goes into clinical trials in human beings. And then they're very quiet when human patients become sick, when a young boy has to be rushed to the emergency because the treatment was actually unsafe for human beings. That's when they become very quiet. But when there's, something that, seems to be promising, they just blare the trumpets and say, look, this has been really, really great. But when things just don't materialize, they're very quiet about it. So that's been one issue. Then the other thing is that Texas A&am has just bald-faced lied about what's going on. When we released the video footage that we obtained back in December of 2016, very quickly, Texas A&am was busily reframing the situation and insisting that these dogs who they were using in their laboratory were, quote unquote, already sick. And the implication there, and something that we saw parroted by people in the Texas A&am community, the students, faculty, and so on, is that A&M wasn't breeding dogs. This is what they were saying, that they weren't actually breeding dogs to make them sick, but they were just sort of like Mother Teresa collecting these dogs who already happened to have canine muscular dystrophy and were trying to treat them. So there was this bald-faced lie, even though we were saying, look, we have these papers. We know that Cornegay for decades has been boasting about the manner in which he artificially inseminates dogs, selectively breeds them so that they have muscular dystrophy. This is something he's written book chapters about. But A&M, just dug in its heels and circled wagons to try to say, oh no, we're not breeding. And that was just a lie.
Yeah. So for the researcher, the vivisector, it's been a real career maker, but it's really been nothing but torture and cruelty for the animal.
Precisely. I mean, you can really map out a full career with promotion, tenure, publications, the whole 9 yards of what it takes to build a solid academic career doing experiments on animals. And you can say, oh, I've got this therapy and I'm going to see what happens in this species. And now I'm going to try it in this other species. Now I'm going to do this. And it's, people who sort of look, in a meta way at these sorts of issues see that it's very easy to write papers that report animal experiments. And so you can build a career with that. It's much harder to do meaningful science, which would be clinical, human-based research. That's much harder to do, but it's more meaningful. Now, for Cornegay, he has written dozens of papers. He has secured a lot of federal grants. That's taxpayer money that he gets to do these experiments on the dogs. He has colleagues, he got his promotions, all of that. So he's built a very nice career for himself, made a nice little life for himself. But what it has to do with patients who suffer from muscular dystrophy, not a whole lot. I mean, he's been stringing them along, and there's the tragedy of what happens to dogs in laboratories and other animals in laboratories. There's that whole tragedy. And then there's the tragedy of human patients and their families whose hopes and, wishes for wellness for their family member are just strung along. And we've seen this firsthand. These people who are so desperate that they invest their hopes in this failing science. And it's just a tragedy for them as well.
So PETA continues to fight this cruelty to both the dogs and to the humans who are involved and, in this false hope. But where are we now? I understand there are 2 major lawsuits that have been filed by PETA to try to stop these experiments at Texas A&M. The first one has to do with Facebook. How is Facebook involved?
Yeah, that's right. My colleagues actually stumbled across this matter that they realized that Facebook was actually censoring anybody from the public and even from its own community, students, alum, and so on, who are posting on Texas A&M's Facebook page. We determined that if certain words were used, like PETA, dog, cruel, painful, experiment, that those posts that people put on Texas A&M's Facebook page would evaporate. And and in fact, Texas A&M has admitted that they had these filters in place to weed out any posts that were critical of A&M's dog laboratory. PETA has partnered with the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is sort of like a American Civil Liberties Union for the web, to sue Texas A&M University for this censorship. And that lawsuit is currently in progress. The other side here, as far as the legal front is concerned, is something that we have been dealing with for quite a while. And that's that right at the outset of our campaign, we wanted to have information about what was happening in the laboratories at that time that we launched the campaign. So we submitted open records requests But once we launched the campaign, A&M started really trying to push us down and sort of barricade the doors and keep us from that information by either charging a lot of money, like just an obscene amount of money for these records, thousands of dollars for maybe a couple dozen pages, or they would say that the records could not be released, and they would say this or that exemption, which we felt was inappropriate. And so we we're not able to get records at first, but it just became so absurd that we filed a lawsuit regarding Texas A&M's holding of records from us, and through that we've been able to get some records, thankfully, and we're waiting to get some more currently.
So the significance of those records, getting that information, what does it help you do? Help you identify the kind of activity, the kind of cruelty, the numbers of dogs? What does it do?
Well, to give one example, Emil, we asked for birth records and breeding records. And this, of course, is key to the lies that A&M has been telling about its dog laboratory, because we knew perfectly well, and we had all manner of documentation that Joe Cornegay, the lead experimenter, had been breeding dogs for this canine muscular dystrophy laboratory. But the university was refusing to hand over those documents. Thanks to the work of our attorneys and external counsel, we were able to get very recently a collection of records, birth and breeding records. And what these records show us is the attempts to add more dogs to the colony that's currently in place at A&M. And I mean, we all know that we already knew that Cornegay was using selective breeding techniques and artificial insemination to produce these dogs who have canine muscular dystrophy. And what these records show us, these records basically go over a 30-month period. And the records show us how many dogs were born into Cornegay's laboratory during that time. And what we see that was especially troubling is that because of the methods used by Cornegay, many dogs are stillborn, and other dogs only survive a day or two before they die. And so in the notes of the breeding records, we saw notes regarding to the puppies who were stillborn, and then other notations such as found deceased in yelping box, failure to thrive, agonal breathing, found dead in box, declining condition, euthanized, agonal and in distress, started gasping, agonal. So we're actually able to paint a picture. There's a clear picture being painted by these records, not only to the fact that Cornegay is deliberately breeding dogs to be sick, but because that the methods are invasive and cruel and result in puppies who are not even viable, and the amount of suffering that that occurs before he produces dogs, or in the process of his producing dogs for his laboratory. So it's clear that the dogs who are quote unquote viable are suffering and living lives of absolute misery. They can't walk, they have difficulty breathing, difficulty eating, and so on. But it's also that those dogs have come out of litters where there were some dogs who were so weak, so sick, that they only survived a day or two.
Yeah, so by the records, you actually can document that the situation is far worse than PETA could have imagined.
Precisely. And the other thing, Emil, is that these records also tell us about the attempts at artificial insemination. And we knew that Cornegay was artificially inseminating female dogs. He has a whole book chapter that's devoted just to how he does this. So if anybody wants to lose their lunch, read that book chapter. What was really horrifying to us is to read how many times they would artificially inseminate a female dog. And, this is basically rape. They're injecting basically a plunger into the dog's vagina to inject the semen from a male dog. And some of these female dogs had artificial insemination done as many as 7 times through a limited period. And this is incredibly invasive, incredibly painful, and really, traumatizing to the dogs. So there's just, all of these different layers of abuse and pain and suffering that are taking place, for this dog colony to exist, which is its own world of suffering and pain and abuse.
And yet, one can say, if, we give Dr. Cornegay the benefit of the doubt, and in fairness, maybe some people out there we're doing this in the name of science, right?
That's definitely what Cornegay says. But the problem is that it seems to me that if you've been doing something for now 38 years, and you can see that the data that you obtain from dogs doesn't apply to humans, even if you're singularly focused on human well-being and you don't care one whit about those dogs who suffer just as much as humans do, who feel pain just as much as we do, and who value their lives just as much as we do, even if you don't care one whit about those dogs, the fact that 38 years of this quote unquote work has failed to produce a cure, has failed to produce a treatment. I mean, I think anybody with clear-eyed vision, anybody who is not blinded by the fact that they're receiving grants, that they have a career that they want to continue to prop up, that they, want to continue to have publications. Anyone who's not blinded by those factors would have to think, okay, maybe it's time to try something else because this ain't working.
He does keep getting grants from both the feds, from, academic community. He's rewarded by his peers. He's rewarded by his university. It seems that there's a certain amount of credibility built in. Are they doing that just because they don't know what else to do, or because if they were to reject them and tell them to try something else, it would be an admission that they've been wasting time, money, and effort?
Yeah, I think what you just said, Emil, that he gets grants and everything else, was true up until about a couple of years ago. And I think that when PETA came forward, and my colleague, Dr. Emily Trennell, who's a neuroscientist, prepared a very detailed scientific critique of Cornegay's experiments. I think up until that time, people were saying, yeah, give him more time. Yeah, something will come of this. But I think now, right now, a silver lining in this whole cloud is that currently Cornegay himself does not have any grants from the National Institutes of Health. He is receiving subcontracts of NIH grants from other experimenters. So he still has that bit of he's still feeding off the trough of the government gravy train. He's still getting these dregs going to him.
Right.
But I think that's going to be cut off soon as well. And, we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to Texas A&M for correspondence, internal as well as external, related to the dog colony. And what's very clear is that Cornegay simply does not have support of many people in the university's administration. Many people are beginning to recognize that his experiments are worthless, and they really just don't want to defend them anymore.
Yeah.
I think anybody with eyes can see that this is just obscenely cruel. What's more is that there's another professor at Texas A&M University who also studies muscular dystrophy, and he was seen as the heir apparent to Cornegay's dog laboratory. But what we learned reading through all of these internal documents is that he's not interested in keeping this laboratory, this dog laboratory. He doesn't see that we're going to get any cures from the dog laboratory. I just want to say one more thing. And that's that the whole establishment, the funding establishment, the university establishment, these establishments, the ones that review animal experimentation, whether it's to give funds or to determine whether an experiment should be approved, these bodies are heavily weighted with animal experimenters. Animal experimenters really make up the preponderance of people who serve on these committees, whether it's a grant agency and the study sections at NIH, those are mostly animal experimenters, whether it's the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee at universities, those are predominantly staffed by animal experimenters. And consequently, you have a situation of the fox, basically guarding the hen house. And so, you're going to get people rubber stamping or signing off on experiments, grants to allow these things to continue.
All right, but it looks like the pressure and the spotlight that PETA is putting on the dog labs at Texas A&M and on Dr. Cornegay's work is actually working. And so the lawsuits are coming along. There's information that's being exposed. There's the Facebook incident and also the Open Records Act that you're getting more of. There's the FOIA request, more information. And so this is kind of like the modern kind of animal activism these days. And you're fighting it on that level, and you're getting, albeit slow, and Texas A&M is still not done. There's some hope, but there's also some normal protesting that has gone on too. Like I understand there was at the veterinary school, there was a graduation demonstration that exposed how some people feel about the puppy experiments there.
And I really encourage your listeners to go over to PETA.org to check out photographs from that protest. We used the records that we obtained, the birth and breeding records that we obtained from Texas A&M, the ones that indicated the stillborn puppies, the puppies who were found deceased in the yelping boxes, the puppies who only survived a day or two. We used those records to do a gravestone demonstration. And this was, as you say, outside the veterinary school's convocation just last week. And so we had tombstones with the names of the puppies who died and information that we found in the observation records. So it was a pretty stark and sobering scene. So as graduates, their parents and family members were going into this auditorium where the convocation was taking place, they passed a patch of grass where the tombstones were set up. So it was sort of like a graveyard for these puppies and dogs. And I saw photographs, and the people are just lined up to go into the auditorium. Everybody's looking at the tombstones and asking questions and getting leaflets from the people, the students, and others who were there to advocate on behalf of the dogs. I really encourage your listeners to check out PETA.org and see photographs from that demonstration. But it was a way that we could take these records that are, tend to be a little bit dense. And, I would very happily, put up PDFs of these records online. But the majority of people wouldn't look. So this was a way to sort of make it visual so people can see the suffering of puppies and dogs in Cornegay's laboratory. So we had that demonstration. We also had a delivery of petitions. And these were postcards that our members and supporters had filled out. And so we had these physical postcards, 44,000 of them that basically had to be wheeled in to President Michael Young's office. And some of our wonderful volunteers and people who our grassroots activists took over to Michael Young's office to deliver those postcards. And the postcards basically, call on Michael Young, to take personal responsibility here and shut down the dog lab.
Now, it's my understanding that it's not just activists and who are supporting this effort, and not just. There are doctors who have patients who are muscular dystrophy patients who don't support the efforts that are going on in dog labs, and they've lent their names in support of your protest effort.
There are 500 doctors who signed a letter to Chancellor John Sharp, the Chancellor of A&M. And these are, of those 500 doctors, more than 100 have personally treated human patients who suffer from muscular dystrophy. And these medical doctors wrote in these letters that as physicians, they were writing to ask the university to halt their experiments on dogs. And they point out that the dog experiments simply are not helping humans. They fail to produce an effective treatment for patients, fail to produce a cure for muscular dystrophy. And so resources were being wasted, and they were seeing the results of this wasted time and effort and money very directly in their practice, for the fact that they don't have a cure, they don't have a treatment that can reverse the debilitating impacts of human muscular dystrophy. So that was, very, very helpful to the campaign because, of course, medical doctors are sort of the sort of that final line, if you will. We can see that there's effort being taken in laboratories with animals, but unless there's some kind of translation or application from laboratory experiments to the human patient bedside, you really have to ask what that effort in the laboratory is about, because it's certainly not helping human beings. And that's what these doctors were attesting to.
So I've been hearing about Texas A&M for at least a couple of years. And you're saying that PETA began the campaign about 2016. Given all these things that we've talked about today, the lawsuits and the protests, and even some of the internal records that show that maybe Cornegay isn't getting the kind of support that he once had, it really does seem like maybe we are close, or maybe PETA is close to an end or a shutdown of maybe shutdown's too extreme, but maybe close to some kind of resolution when it comes to the dog labs at Texas A&M.
I agree with you, Emil. I think we're very close. PETA has many things to recommend it, not least of which is that we are scrappy and we are persistent. And so as long of a campaign as this has been, we are in it to win it. We're not going to turn our backs on those dogs. There are about 90 dogs in Cornegay's laboratory right now, and we're not turning our backs on those dogs, especially, when we see that this breeding has continued. We feel that with this information now and the fact that A&M finally relented and gave us these documents after putting up a pretty strong fight, we feel that if we continue to persist and continue to let the university know that we're not going away, and what they should do is exactly, what we know that many entities at A&M want to do, which is to shut down that laboratory. And at that point, we'd like to see the dogs being adopted out into good homes, so that they can live out their days in, with the love of a family, which is exactly what they deserve. And we would like to see A&M redirect any resources that they have to human relevant technologies and human relevant methods, so that they can actually help human patients who suffer with muscular dystrophy.
Well, let's hope it happens soon, because even though we're close, Texas A&M continues to torture these dogs. And once again, for people who still don't quite understand, what is the life like for these dogs in the dog labs at Texas A&M?
Yeah, it's actually just misery from cradle to grave. It's unmitigated misery. These dogs are born to be sick, and they're bred to be sick. And so they have difficulty, breathing. They have difficulty swallowing. They're fed a liquid gruel because, their jaws are not muscular enough, to permit eating solid foods. As a consequence of that, they're very, very thin. They're held in barren kennels, and people can go to PETA.org and check out the video footage that we obtained. These dogs are held in barren kennels, basically cement and metal. Very often they're not even given a blanket, which they could really use given that they're so thin. Their bones protrude from their bodies. If you watch them walking across the kennel in these videos, you can see that they have difficulty walking. If anyone has ever suffered any kind of muscular disability or some sort of pain in one's legs, then you know what it feels like to walk with pain across a floor. You see that in the dogs. I mean, that's exactly what's going on with those dogs. They have tremendous pain when they walk, and so they walk very deliberately and with a tentative sort of in a tentative manner, because there's pain in every step.
The whole disease was induced. They were given the disease.
Canine muscular dystrophy can be bred into the dog. So if you select for certain genes, you can produce dogs who are born with canine muscular dystrophy. That's the whole idea. On the day they're born, they can do some genetic testing and determine whether these dogs are afflicted with canine muscular dystrophy, carry the gene, so they're called carriers, or are normal. And so the disease is inflicted in the dogs by the very breeding. That's how the colonies are brought into existence.
To me, that's what people sometimes don't understand. They don't understand that it's not like well dogs come in and this stuff is inflicted on them. They're bred to have the disease and to live this life of misery, which is more cruel, I think, and more diabolical from, when you, to inflict this and say, your only purpose is to live this life of misery. And it's still not going to lead us to an answer to human muscular dystrophy, but you're going to have to go through this suffering. That to me is cruel.
And I mean, it's difficult for me to really compare atrocities, whether, a dog who's maybe purchased from a shelter, like at Louisiana State University, who maybe had a nice life, but then is brought into the laboratory after being purchased from the shelter and is then tortured and killed. I mean, it all seems pretty awful to me. Basically, to be used as a means to somebody else's end is wrong. And to be used in cruel experiments where you're essentially treated like an experimental tool. I mean, the very fact that the experimenters don't even have enough kindness to supply blankets or playtime with these dogs. And these dogs really just live lives of absolute misery. They should be in homes where they're loved by a family. They should be cared for the fact that they are sick. Instead, they're treated like experimental tools, tormented, used in experiments where their muscles are stretched painfully, injected, subjected to painful blood draws, subjected to painful muscle biopsies, this whole litany of cruelties. And then they're killed when they're no longer needed and their bodies are dissected and examined. These dogs are just used as a means to an end. And frankly, we can see that end is not to help human beings. The end is to produce publications, to get tenure, to get promotions, to get grants. I mean, that's the whole point of this enterprise. I mean, anyone with half a brain would have recognized decades ago that this was a failing enterprise, and they didn't. They just continued, on their merry way, producing dogs who were sick, having these horrible laboratories and using the dogs as a means to an end.
Yeah, and that's why this protest and this action against Texas A&M continues. So, Alka, look, what can people do to help PETA end this suffering that's going on at Texas A&M?
We have a petition on our website. Nearly 200,000 people have already signed the petition. If you haven't, please sign it and then share it with everybody you know. And if they think that maybe, the dogs are treated as well as possible, show them the video footage. The video footage will break your heart. These are dogs who are just like the dogs who we have at home, the dogs whom we love and treat as the family members they are. These dogs feel pain no less. They crave human attention no less, and yet they're treated like inanimate objects. So I implore your listeners to, if they haven't already, watch the video footage, share it with your friends, share it with your family members, share it with your neighbors, coworkers, everyone you know. If you have friends in Texas, calls from people in Texas, College Station, especially, having the university know that people in their community don't appreciate what's going on and believe that what's going on is a moral atrocity. Really, really hammering it home. I think we're in the home stretch. And I think that with a lot of focused effort at this point, we can really push the university over the edge and free those dogs.
Dr. Alka Chandna, PETA VP, on the cruelty of the Texas A&M dog labs. Take action. Go to PETA.org and see the video of the bad science. Sign the petition and help end the travesty of that bad science at Texas A&M's dog labs. Go to PETA.org now. And that's our program for today. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or read me at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund website. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA with a kind donation at PETA.org. Our music is provided by Carbon Works. Check them out on YouTube. Thank you for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.